Example B of recording a diary. In the first box, titled Trigger, include day, date and time. Example B has Friday the 28th of February, 9:30 p.m. Several people had already come into the bar and left the door open. We were sitting just by the door, 3 of us, and it was very cold outside, so there was a draft when the door was left open. None of them gave a damn about us, just marched straight in and went up and got their drinks. It wasn't until about half a dozen people had done this that I reacted. Then there's an arrow pointed to the next box of your diary, in example B, where it's got response, what did you do? And in example B, it's got, to the first few people that came in, I didn't do anything. But when the 5th guy came in, I just got up and threatened him. I stood in front of him and told him exactly what I thought of him and his type, so that the whole bar could hear. That was pretty much an end to the evening. The other 2 didn't really get settled again, and we went home after about half an hour. Example C. In the first box, Trigger, including the day, date and time. As our example, it says, Tuesday the 3rd of June, 8 p.m. We were sitting eating a meal when yet again my husband was chewing his food so loudly that half the street would be able to hear him. I'm sure he does it just to annoy me, or at least he doesn't care that it does annoy me. What he does is to get his mouth full of food and then spend ages chewing every mouthful and talking to me while he does it. Then there's an arrow leading to the next box of the diary, which is the response, what did you do, of example C. I didn't say or do anything. I just felt really tight inside, and I didn't talk to him properly, and I just felt sad being married to him. I've told him about it dozens of times before, so what's the point going on about it again? But somehow it just symbolises the way he is. He doesn't care about me, just about him. Example D of the diaries. The first box, Trigger, including date, day and time. Wednesday the 17th of September, 5:30 p.m. Ian, who is 13, dropped a coffee mug on the kitchen floor and it shattered. There was no coffee in it, just the mug, but that's typical of him. He just doesn't care. He thinks money grows on trees and anything he breaks I will replace. Then we have an arrow leading to the next box of the diary of example D, where it's got the response, what did you do? I completely lost it. I shouted at him and told him to get out of my sight. It took me a good half an hour to an hour to calm down at all. Even when he was upstairs, I went up and told him again. Example E of the diaries. The first box, Trigger, include day, date and time. Wednesday the 7th of June, 3:30 p.m. The boss asked me to go out to Scudamore Avenue to sort out a call there. The occupier wanted some wiring looked at that they weren't sure was safe. The thing is that the boss knew I already had plenty of work on, and he was just taking advantage of me because he knew I wouldn't complain. Then there's an arrow leading to the next box of the diary with the response, what did you do? I was just very short with him so that he would know I was irritated and thought he was out of order. But I finished off the work that had to be done in the base and then went off and sorted this other person's wiring out. And I did the jobs properly. Example F of the diaries. The first box. The trigger, including the day, date and time. Thursday the 10th of April, 6:30 p.m. I had been on at my daughter all day long to tidy her room, and she kept saying she would do it in a minute or a bit later. Then at about 6:30 I found her sitting in the bath, just washing her hair and deliberately provoking me, saying, "What are you going to do about that then?" Then an arrow leading to the response box. What did you do? I really let rip. I shouted and screamed at her, for it must have been 10 minutes. She went really pale, and looking back at it, I was over the top, but it worked. She did tidy her room later on. Example G. In the first box, the trigger, including day, date and time. Wednesday the 27th of July, 4:15 p.m. There was no real trigger beyond the fact that I was feeling very stressed out as usual. At work these days there are just so many demands on me from so many different people that I cannot possibly fulfill everything that everybody expects of me. Therefore, when Phil just made some throwaway remark, that was the last straw. Then the arrow leading to the response box. What did you do? Has I just blew my top at Phil and criticised him for his attitude. It was totally unfair. What he had said was just by way of banter. Me blowing my top was much more to do with my state of mind than Phil's attitude. But anyway, I apologised to him later on, and things seem to be okay now, more or less. Reading your diary. Well, never mind reading your diary for the moment. Let's first of all get good at reading other people's diaries. Even before that, let's recap on what the point of reading these diaries is. It is to obtain insight into what makes you irritable and angry so that you can take action about it. And to do that, you will first of all have to develop the skill of reading diaries astutely. Now let's take the examples in order. First of all, look again at example A, in which Colin tells how he was driven to distraction by his neighbour's kids playing football in the street. Which of the following possibilities do you think was the trigger? Number 1, the kids repeatedly running across his grass. Number 2, the football hitting his window. Number 3, the thought that his neighbours showed no consideration for him. Or number 4, the belief that kids playing in the street makes the area look poor. In this particular case, the answer Colin gave was both number 1 and number 2. But what really irritated Colin was that the neighbours had no consideration for people around them, and indeed made the street look like a rough area. So in a way, Colin's anger had more to do with his appraisal and judgment of the trigger, rather than the trigger itself. Nevertheless, if he wants to sort out his irritability and anger, he needs to spot the visible trigger of the boys playing football. Once he knows this is his weak spot, then he can sort out how to reappraise it, if that is what he decides on. If Colin wanted to become less irritated and angry, he could view the children playing outside in a different light. He could view it simply as kids having a good time and showing that the street is a lively place to live. Do you think that is likely to work with this man? No, neither did I. So what is left? In this case, the main thing is to look in the response box. If you recollect, his response was to take the ball from the kids and storm round and shout at their mother. What other response do you think he might have made? Which of the following do you think would be best? Number 1, switch on the television, turn the volume up loud until their game is over. Number 2, every time the kids appear on the street, go round to their mother and put his point of view in as friendly a way as possible. Number 3, do nothing, just blank it all from his mind. I would suggest that option number 2 is the best one, to go round and put his point of view amicably, just as often as he likes, preferably from his point of view just as soon as the kids appear on the street. Many angry and irritable people make the mistake of thinking that the best reaction is free, to do nothing at all. This is not necessarily the case, particularly if you think that you are legitimately aggrieved. In such cases, it is only right to stick up for your rights assertively, but assertive does not mean angry or aggressive. So in example A, perhaps the best bet is for Colin to alter his response, and this is what he did. Nevertheless, the starting point was for him to be clear about what triggered his anger, rather than just thinking he was generally bad-tempered. What about example B, where 5 people, one at a time, came into the bar and left the door open behind them? They came at roughly 15 to 20 minutes intervals, and finally Steve got so angry that he confronted person number 5. So what was it that really triggered Steve's anger? There are several possibilities. Which one do you think is most accurate? Number 1, the door being left open and the consequent cold draft. Number 2, the expression on the 5th man's face, being so self-centered and not caring about the cold air coming in. Number 3, Steve's perception that he was being made to look foolish, having to get up all the time to shut the door that somebody else had left open. Or number 4, Steve's perception that he was not being given enough consideration by these other people. Here, the literal trigger is number 1, the door being left open and the ensuing blast of cold air. That, possibly in conjunction with the expression on the person's face, led to Steve's appraisal that he was being made to look foolish, that he was not being shown enough consideration. So what could he have done to get rid of the trigger? After all, getting rid of the trigger is normally what we want to do. If we can get rid of the trigger, it stops the whole thing snowballing. Which of the following would you recommend? Number 1, move to a different part of the bar, away from the door. Number 2, don't look at the person's face so it doesn't annoy you. Number 3, realise that you are not being made a fool of. Number 4, don't worry about whether people are showing you consideration or not. There is an argument in favour of each of these. Which ones did you choose? Personally, I would go for number 1, even though it's not very psychological. There are some things that most people would find irritating, and sitting by a door that people keep leaving open is probably one of them. But what do you do? I hear you saying, if there are no other seats in the bar. In that case, we have to look at the response. How did Steve actually respond? He jumped up and behaved in a threatening way to poor old person number 5, having said nothing at all to the previous 4 people. So what might have been a better response? Maybe he should just have asked each person coming in to shut the door in a non-aggressive way. We will look at this again later. Now, you may have noticed that this bar example is rather different from the previous one. You may feel that there's more point in discussing the neighbour example, because that is an ongoing situation which keeps happening every day or every week, and it's a good one to sort out a solution for. With the bar example, we seem to be harking back to something that's over and done with, so what's the point in going through it all over again? The answer is that you can get so good at analysing situations that you analyse them automatically, even as they're happening. So whereas Steve may not find himself in an identical situation again, sitting right by a bar door that people keep leaving open, he may find himself in a somewhat similar one. In that case, if he has worked out a way of dealing with it, he will be able to analyse it even as it's going on, and hopefully act in a better way. What about example C? This was the case of Pam, who is so acutely annoyed by her husband when he eats noisily. Again, what do you think was the real trigger for her annoyance? Number 1, the sheer decibel level of her husband's eating. He should learn to eat more quietly. Number 2, the fact that he carried on talking to her while he was still chewing. Number 3, the fact that she saw it as symbolising their incompatibility. Number 4, the fact that she had nothing better to do than worry about how much noise her husband made when he was eating. Numbers 1 and 2 are the literal triggers. So how could we remove them? Earplugs to cut down the decibel level won't help. Talk to him while he is chewing so that he isn't tempted to talk while chewing? Perhaps not. Really, the problem lies in Pam's appraisal that the chewing symbolises their incompatibility. So ultimately it is either that or their incompatibility itself that needs working on. Nevertheless, she does need to be clear on the initial trigger so that she can take action on it. In the interim, she might also ask him to chew a bit more quietly, but that would probably be missing the point. The next example, D, involved Sue's teenage son Ian, who dropped a mug on the floor and broke it. Again, what was the trigger? Number 1, the mug breaking. Number 2, the cost of the mug. Number 3, the loud noise the mug made when it hit the floor. Number 4, Sue's appraisal that Ian is careless and needs to be taught a lesson. Well, number 1 is obviously the literal answer, but it is quickly followed by number 4. Clearly, once Sue knows what the triggers are for her thinking like that, he is careless and needs to be taught a lesson, she can prepare a more helpful appraisal and train herself to use it at such times. Such an appraisal might be, we all drop things on the floor from time to time, youngsters especially. There's no need to get uptight about it. So what have we got so far from looking at these first 4 examples? It is sometimes quite difficult to see exactly what the trigger is, because the literal trigger and the appraisal are jumbled together. It is worthwhile disentangling these 2 aspects, because then you can prepare a more helpful appraisal if need be, and be ready to use it next time the trigger for your irritation and anger appears. Keeping a diary on the model of Diary 1 is helpful in doing this. Often the key lies in learning a different response. For example, tackling the neighbour in a different way, asking people to shut the door, tackling the underlying issue of compatibility, telling the youngster to brush up the broken mug. But the same argument applies. Before we can prepare a more helpful response, we need to be clear about what triggers our irritation and anger. Let's move on now and have a look at the other examples. The 5th one, E, was about Alan, the electrician who was asked to do too much by his boss. What was the real trigger? Number 1, being overloaded with work. Number 2, feeling he is being put upon by his boss. Clearly the literal trigger is being overloaded with work. Feeling put upon by his boss is the appraisal Alan makes. In example F, Anne lost her temper with her 12-year-old daughter who was washing her hair in the bath. What was the trigger for her anger? Number 1, the sight of her daughter in the bath. Number 2, the fact that her daughter hadn't tidied her bedroom. Number 3, the fact that she felt her daughter was being defiant. Number 4, the sense of frustration that she wasn't bringing her daughter up very well. You will notice that a 4th option has crept in here that has got nothing to do with baths, tidy bedrooms or anything else. And this is sometimes the case. For example, some people will fight and argue simply because they are bored or frustrated or whatever. So in this case, it is a possibility that Anne's anger has more to do with the frustration of wondering whether she is bringing her daughter up well than anything else. In fact, frustration in general is frequently a trigger for anger or aggression, as was discovered by Miller and his colleagues back in the 1930s. A finding published as the frustration-aggression hypothesis. So what was your best answer as to what the trigger was for Anne? Possibly it was a mixture of frustration, partly to do with whether she is bringing her daughter up well, partly to do with of her inability to get the girl to tidy her room. And just seeing her daughter sitting in the bath when she wanted her to be doing something else. Her perception of defiance is more an appraisal, following on from the trigger. And our final example G was to do with Ken, the stressed out executive. What was the trigger for his irritability? Number 1, trying to cope with more work than he could reasonably do. Number 2, his colleague Phil being tactless. Number 3, just being in a bad mood that day. From his account, it sounds as though it was a combination of all 3. Certainly he was overloaded with work, so he was in a bad mood, but also perhaps the colleague was a shade tactless. Triggers can sometimes be slightly complex, as in my colleague being tactless when I'm overworked and in a bad mood. Quite possibly none of the 3 elements mentioned, tactlessness, overwork, bad mood, would cause him to be irritable on its own. Read in your diary again. The previous section will have got you pretty good at reading diaries in general, which means that you are also going to be pretty good at reading your own. So all you have to do now is keep a diary of most of the times you get irritable and angry, along the lines described. Then analyse it to determine your triggers. What you are looking for is a short list of triggers for your irritation and anger. Here are some that other people have produced. The neighbours playing loud music. The kids next door playing football in the street. The people next door showing no consideration for their neighbours. Other people being inconsiderate, as in the bar door. Other people putting themselves above me, as in queue jumping. My husband eating his food noisily. My husband, my wife, my children, my partner, George at work, my son being careless, being kept waiting, being contradicted or proved wrong in public, being overworked by my boss, being dumped by my boyfriend, my partner telling other people about things which were just between us, my wife flirting with other men, being made to look foolish in public, my daughter being lazy, my daughter being disobedient, my son telling lies, people stealing from me or damaging my property, bouncers, policemen, being carved up by another driver, being crammed in the tube, being stressed out, being bored, being tired.